Hey, it's Dave from the Camera Store. Today we're going to talk about what focal length means when it comes to choosing lenses. When you first start looking into photography, you can get quickly overrun by how many different lenses are available for you. Now you have a look and a feel that you want to achieve with your photography, and how do you get that? What lens is going to be the best choice for you? I mean, in front of me here, I've got a whole selection from Sony, from a 14mm all the way up to a big 600mm here. When do I use one? When do I use the other? And what does it actually mean when I start talking about 14mm compared to 600? Let's dig into that now. Well, let's get a little bit techie here. 35mm film has been by far and away the most popular film format, has been around for decades. It's still incredibly popular, and in the digital side of things, they call it full frame. Now, back in those days, when you're designing a camera, the first thing, and it makes complete sense, is you're trying to recreate what the human eye would see. So how can I recreate that onto a film plane? So we start coming up with these different lenses, and the first lenses that came out were 50mm lenses, because they most closely replicated what the human eye sees, perspective-wise. So that means when I'm looking through the camera with a 50mm lens, and I look at my subject matter with my own eyes, they both appear the same size. So where do they even come up with the number 50mm? Let's take a look at this Sony 50mm lens here. I mean, on the front it says 50, but is that 50mm? Is this 50mm? Where do they come up with this number? Effectively, what they're doing is going for the optical center of the lens to the film plane or the focal plane. Now, let's see if I can help simplify this with some visual aids. Now, I am by no means an artist when it comes to drawing, but let's see what we can do with this whiteboard. Effectively, when you are focusing a lens, this is my lens here and the camera attached to it. There's the focal plane, this is the film plane. So as light enters the lens, it's focused to a single point. This is what's called the point of convergence, where all the light comes together. Imagine using the magnifying glass and being able to focus that light into a single point. That's the point of convergence. Now what happens here is that light is spread to the sensor. The distance we're measuring here is from the point of convergence to the sensor plane. This gives us our focal length. So the focal length of the lens is the point of convergence to the focal plane or the film plane of the camera. Now you can find that on your camera. Any camera that has an interchangeable lens system is going to have a line with a circle on it. That's where your sensor is located inside the camera. So that's where they get 50mm from. Now, why are some lenses much bigger than others? Well, take a look at this ultra-wide 14mm lens. So if we remember what we talked about, the point of convergence, it's only 14mm away from the film plane. That means that point of convergence is very far back in this lens. So it can be a relatively small lens. If I want to bring things in much closer, if I want to do like a 600mm lens here, this lens needs to be this big because that point of convergence is much further away from the sensor, hence the size of this lens. So if the 50mm lens is the standard lens that most closely represents what the human eye sees, why don't we just use it for everything? Well, there's a big reason we have multiple lenses on the market. For instance, I find a 50mm lens a little limiting. I prefer a 35mm. That's my favorite focal length because it's just the most natural feel for me for capturing people in their workplace and environmental portraits. I absolutely love it for that. Now we can go much wider if we need to. For instance, this is a 24mm lens, and we also have a 14mm lens for ultra wide. And of course, these different focal lengths all have different applications, and some are better suited for certain subjects than others. However, there's no real rules. You can use one lens for whatever subject you want. However, some are more applicable for certain applications than others. So when it comes to comparing all these lenses, we're concentrating only on full frame sensors right now, just to keep this process simple, because there's so much to talk about. When it comes to choosing a proper focal length, we have so many different options. So where do we even start? 50mm has always been a great starting point to kind of get your feet wet when it comes to photography. And then you quickly find out, oh, I wish I had a wider field of view. I want to capture more of the interiors, or I can't quite get the skyscapes or the cloudscapes that I want through the 50mm lens, and I can't bring that bird in as close as I like to with my 50mm lens. What are my options going either way? Now we're going to go wide and then even wider with the next two lenses. So a 24mm lens is a very popular lens as well. If the 35 is still not wide enough for you, if you find yourself in environments where you just can't get far enough back or can't get to the position that you want, you just like that aesthetic, 24mm gives you that look. Now if you take 50 divided by 24, it's just a little over 2 times. So when you're looking through a 24mm lens, things are half the size of what they would be in a 50mm lens. Kind of cool math if you want to play that way. Now, a 14mm lens here is an ultra-wide lens. It's incredibly wide and it's very interesting to work with. I love this lens for big skyscapes and cloudscapes, and some interiors can look monumental when you use this lens like this, although it is tricky to use. And it's not a lens I want to use for everything. For instance, take a look at this portrait of me done with a 14mm lens. This is not an attractive portrait lens at all. Now, it's kind of fun if you use this lens for some kind of artistic photos. If you're into snowboarding, skateboarding, or you can have a lot of fun with this lens for some kind of artistic portraits, if you want to put it that way, but it's not my primary portrait lens. And that's where we're going next, is the other side of 50mm. Now, if we start going the other direction on my table, here we have an 85mm and a 135mm. These lenses bring things in much closer than our human eye sees, and when it's pretty cool to see because it also cuts out the background a lot more. These lenses are perfect for shooting portraits. Take a look at these shots here, and comparing my 14mm portrait with a 135mm portrait, it is drastically different. The separation, everything looks so much nicer with the 135. Both the 85 and the 135 are almost purpose-built to shoot portraits. Now, you certainly can shoot anything you want with them. However, you might find them a little bit tight to shoot interiors with. Now, where all these other lenses are a little bit smaller and a little unassuming, this is the big one from us today. This is the 2-600 from Sony. And the 600mm allows me to shoot birds in flight. It allows me to shoot football or soccer outside because I can bring the subject in much closer. Now, if we go back to the math we used on that 24mm, this is a 600mm. Divide that by 50, our standard lens, and we bring things in 12 times closer than what the human eye sees. This allows us to really get close to the action and the wildlife. So as good as this lens is for outdoor sports and wildlife, it doesn't really apply itself to interiors, for instance, and definitely not for portraits. You certainly can shoot a head and shoulder portrait. If we carry along our theme, what we're doing with our head and shoulder portrait, you can see the working distance. A proper portrait lens allows me a nice working distance with my subject. I can still communicate with them quite nicely. But doing a head and shoulder portrait with a 600mm lens, we are yelling distance to each other to communicate. So there you have it. I hope this simple and fun video really helps you understand a little bit more about why a lens is called what it is, and a little bit more understanding of why you use one focal length over the other. I encourage you to go out and try different focal lengths. See what works for you. Some people fall in love with the ultra wide angle. Some people fall in love with a portrait lens or a huge telephoto. I encourage you to try all the different focal lengths out and really play around with it and see what works for you. I want to know what you guys think of the focal lengths that you've been using. Have you ever been surprised by a focal length that you never thought you'd use? Now, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Follow us both on Instagram, and please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we'll catch you again next time. So if I pull in my chunk, it'll... Hey, thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to check out more of our recent content, click up here. And if you're a Canadian and you want to support local, check out thecamerastore.com down here.